I was also the director of Center for South Asian Studies before Anna, and I did a storytelling, art body and storytelling symposium, which was very successful in bringing artists together. So thank you, Anna, for bringing an artist. I'm happy to introduce Sadaf Padder. Sadaf Padder is a Brooklyn-based independent curator, writer, and community organizer focused on excavating under-recognized contemporary art movements and histories related to the global South. She has curated across the country, from Philadelphia to Los Angeles to Martha's Vineyard, focusing on themes of social justice, futurism, radical liberation movements, caste abolition, climate change, and neo-mythology to weave connections between various communities. Padder is uniquely informed by her background as a public school educator and administrator of 8 years. She maintains a dedicated community-based practice where she develops youth art programs and internships. Her curation has earned mentions in LA Weekly, Hyperallergic, and Art News, and resulted in acquisitions of BIPOC women artists by the Baltimore Museum of Art, Northwestern University, and Nyon McAvoy Foundation. Padder has contributed writing to Visual Aids, Artsy, UpMag, and Hyperallergic. She also serves as a board member of the Chickweed Alliance and Art Page, is lead fundraiser for Grown in Haiti, where she's building a community center and artist retreat at Rahmel, Haiti, and is a member of Phoenix Community Garden, where she runs community events and youth programs. She's a Create Change alumna with the Laundromat Project, as well as a 2022-23 Emily J. Hall Tremaine Fellow by Hyperallergic. I welcome you, Sadaf, and look forward to
Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be gathered here today because, quite simply, I couldn't have imagined of a South Asian Future Symposium when I was younger, let alone getting to attend one. So it's really an honor to be in this space with you all today, and I want to thank those who are gathered here physically, those who are here spiritually, and the generations of thinkers who really paved the way for us to be here today. I'm going to, in today's talk, kind of share a working framework of South Asian futurisms and observed trends. My aim is to really map a topography of the sheer number of artists I see operating within this framework and render visible the multiple strategies they're using in order to do so. So I'm going to do this by highlighting artists who are mining using technology to mine archival and oral histories, craft hybridized and mutated beings, new mythologies, rituals, and concepts of time towards speculative, expansive, and posthuman futures. I also want to preface that this is a very knowledgeable group we have, and I'm very excited to connect and to learn from you, because I have often felt like I'm on an island sometimes. But also recognizing there's going to be points in my talk today that I'm going to describe or define terms that are already very familiar to some of you, in the understanding that I never want to purport knowing what someone might know, and that there are people tuning in, I know also virtually, to whom that this is very new realms. So there's going to be moments of that, and those are moments where I also invite you to input and share your perspectives or questions as well. So I'll give a bit of context of kind of how I began to arrive at this framework. I first began my research on South Asian futurisms when I was in Haiti, actually, in the regenerative food systems of growing Haiti in Cap Rouge, where I am co-director of a reforestation organization, where we've been growing and distributing fruit-bearing trees since 2014. We've distributed over 15,000 trees in 2,000 different species. These forests are very simply where I feel the most protected and safest in the world. And where I found the root to my own roots while I'm here is actually where I've been able to feel closer to where my father's from, in Kashmir. I've spent more time here than I have there. So my father is from India-occupied Kashmir, a region devastatingly beautiful and thus devastated for its beauty. It's located in the valley of the Himalayas. Again, many of you probably already know this. Properly called paradise on earth. Yet it is the most densely militarized region in the world, with 1 soldier to every 6 civilians. Haiti, and meanwhile, is one of the most heavily deforested countries, retaining less than 1% of its primary forests and facing mass extinction of its biodiversity. I consider as well that we are gathered here today on a land that is also illegally occupied and has been historically exploited for its resources. So why is it that I began to dream of futurity while in Cap Rouge, Haiti, of all places? Dalit, Kashmiri poet, called this mythic terrain, a diasporic consciousness that endorses cultural pluralism and upholds the cause of nature, transcending geographical and topographical specificities, in his case, of Kashmir and Arizona. While traversing the country on a road trip, mourning the loss of a loved one, Ali lamented, I don't know I've begun mapping America, the city limits of evanescence now everywhere. The superstitious mountains of Arizona are not the Karakoram Range or the Hindu Kush Mountains, but there are so many similarities in mythic structures across the world. This cry to be remembered and the language to be remembered. And so my aim today is really to dig into this concept of mythic terrain, how we can continue to connect our concept of diaspora transnationally and across regions and across communities. It was during conversations with my maternal grandmother, my Nani Ama, as I spent time in Haiti, FaceTiming her to show the fruits we were growing, that I recognized, in the words of Ali, the mythic structure between Haiti and South Asia. Nani Ama tells me of her family's orchard in Bihar, India, and this is her. This is the oldest photo we have of in our family. This is the 1920s, pre-partition. And she tells me how she's not seen jackfruit growing like this in its natural habitat since leaving India during the partition, and then Pakistan again due to religious persecution of our sect, Ahmadiyya. I will say I also really appreciated the last talk by Nudrat. It's the first time I've actually heard someone speak on the anti-blasphemy laws, the blasphemy laws in Ahmadiyya, and I felt very seen, so I appreciate that very much. So I shared this with the understanding that in order to imagine the future, we must reimagine the past and conceptualize the present. Oh, there we go.
Put it out of your hand.
Okay. Okay, got it. I share this with the understanding that in order to imagine the future, we must reimagine the past and conceptualize the present, collapsing linear concepts of time to consider in all directions. As we imagine South Asian futurisms, we must summon land first and foremost as an ultimate witness. We must consider our relationship to Earth as we reckon with the global climate crisis. As we imagine South Asian futurisms, we must be willing to queer our concept of diaspora, beyond geographical borders to mythic terrains, from the river to the sea, so to speak. Art becomes a crucial tool in these radical orientations. In this context, contemporary art is a path forward, galvanizing movements to valorize histories and imagine futures. I seek a constructive, open-ended, and mutable framework of South Asian futurisms, spacious enough to encompass the subaltern narratives of caste-oppressed and religiously marginalized communities, one that is transnational, transreligious, intersectional, classless, caste-free, feminist, and queer. Now, what do I mean when I say queer as it relates to futurity? Queer in the sense of Jose Munoz Esteban in his seminal book, Cruising Utopia, that queerness deeply challenges more than sexual and gender identity. It resists and transcends categorization every time society seeks to define and confine it. Futurism is a feeling of desiring beyond what we have been conditioned to believe we can have and want. Queer in the sense of Gayatri Gopinath and her concept of queer regional imaginary proposes that visual culture allows us to draw alternative cartographies and see things queerly, specifically how art is being used to create possibilities of regional connections, such as in the words of Adishahid Ali. Now, in order to talk about South Asian futurisms, I must talk about the mother of futurisms, Afro-Futurism, and its roots in Black feminist thought. The framework that has given birth to a Cambrian explosion of futurisms, such as Gulf Futurism, Indo-futurism, and indigenous futurisms, and many more. Throughout my research, nearly all of the artists I spoke to and interviewed referenced Octavia Butler, Walida Imarisha, Audre Lorde, and many more as sources of inspiration. In the context of this presentation, I will continue to return to Afro-Futurism as a landing point, elucidating parallels as well as divergences. So again, very briefly, and this might be familiar territory to some of you here, the origins of the term Afro-Futurism. It was originally coined by Mark Derry in his 1994 essay, Black to the Future. Its function to describe observed trends in Black literature and technoculture, which is now expanded to contemporary art. Itasha Womack, author, artist, educator, says Afro-Futurism is a way of looking at the future of alternate realities, but through a Black cultural lens. And when I'm speaking of Black cultures, I'm referring to people all over the world who embrace that identity. Afro-Futurism is an artistic aesthetic, it's a method, it's a practice, it integrates imagination, liberation, technology, and mysticism. Now, in using the term Afro-Futurism, we have to acknowledge certain criticisms and parameters. The term can skew the Black experience into a monolith from the point of the view of the African-American individual in America. There are creatives and critics who opt for terms such as African Futurism, naming this as an ability to conceive of Blackness outside of the Black American diaspora or independent of whiteness and the history of enslavement. Additionally, we must acknowledge that before Mark Derry coined this term, there were plenty of speculative fictions across Africa and the diaspora, with works engaging with African societies and futuristic fantasies incorporating mythology, myth, and superstition. So similarly, we cannot deny the appeal of veering towards a term like Indo-futurism. It's sexy, it rolls off the tongue, it's like a perfect syllabic volley to Afro-Futurism. But given the limits and possibilities of the English language and its terminology, Indo-futurism would be a dangerously homogenizing category, validating mass appropriation and erasure of several distinct indigenous tribes, religions, and microcultures throughout the subcontinent. Thus, we must pivot from it sharply as a center point. And there are futuristic frameworks that I'm seeing that are using Indo-futurism, and we can return to this as well. An example I'll give is Antariksha Studio and their Battle Royale Indus Valley, which debuted their advertisement last year in Times Square. Huge billboards spilling across 42nd Street. And the founders came out after kind of claiming and recognizing the danger and the mass commercial appeal of places like Bollywood picking up Indo-futurism and taking it and running, but at the same time erasing exactly what we're talking about now. So something to be very cognizant of, and something that I do see rising, and that is we're going to continue to compel and combat in being in spaces like this. So in the words of Tanais, a Bengali American author, in their book In Sensorium for My People, we must consider the people beyond India's borders, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Kashmir, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, all the way to Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Fiji are forgotten. We have less proximity to whiteness, our lands and histories outside the bounds of the great Indian imaginary. In summary, we must refuse to center the imperial metropole of India. This is more urgent by the day. There are, of course, also limits to a term like South Asian futurism, or criticisms that we must acknowledge that I know, Vijay, you kind of got at yesterday as well. It can be reductive. Those who are unaware might simply equate South Asian to Indian. This is why I hold the S in futurisms as a plural for now, just to indicate the multiplicity of the diaspora and holding open a space for subaltern communities. For the purpose of this presentation today, South Asia refers to a geographical region, and I use this as a conceptual placeholder. It's a term that might morph and change as we continue this research from a perspective that has language of land, of something older and other than Western that can bloom with many meanings and resist monolithic typification. After all, the ability to reorient and reclaim language and to self-define is a strategy of decolonization, an act of self-love, and a step towards liberation. There may be artists I highlight that do not particularly identify with the term of South Asian futurism. So I would urge us to consider South Asian futurism as really being in lateral relationship to the many futuristic frameworks of futurisms that I will share today. The wide range of perspectives I encountered shared a desire to specify an inclusive language, and I'm going to respect that desire, which would reflect both a commitment to generational healing and a call to action, to recognize and interrupt the traumas of caste, climate change, and mass displacement. These frameworks include, but are not limited to, Dalit futurism, Afro-Futurism, Adivasi futurism, subaltern futurism, Sufi futurism, and queer Muslim futurism, to name a few. For as long as oppression has existed, so too has resistance, resilience, and imagination. Just like with the Afro-Futuristic movement, there have been thinkers, artists, and musicians, leaders who operated within this realm long before the term existed. I think specifically of Sen Ravidas, the 15th century mystic Indian poet and a radical anti-caste intellectual, was a multitudinous following who sang of Begumpura half of a millennium ago. The mythical city was a place without sorrow or pain, without hierarchy or government, without caste or class. Which leads me to our first major point of divergence as we consider South Asian futurisms blooming from a place of Afro-Futurism, which is that South Asian diaspora must contend with the gaping wound that is caste and reckon with the fact that it continues to exist throughout the diaspora and within the United States. As Thanmuri Sundararajan, author of Trauma of Caste, writes, we often do not get the opportunity to be architects of the future because we are not nursing the wounds of the present. But it's important that we have the ability for us to dream of Dalit feminist futures together. If Sri Guru Ravi Das could dream, then what other caste equitable utopias lie within you? And so for this section, I'm going to really draw upon and center some of these voices who have been seminal in my own learning. And we're going to begin with Dalit feminist sci-fi writer Mimi Mondal, who shares that in a world where fundamental laws can be rewritten, it is also illuminating which of them are not. The author's priorities are openly on display when a culture of non-humans is still patriarchal. There are no queer people in a far future society. In a speculative world where it is possible to rewrite laws, rules, and stereotypes, leaving them unchanged is also political. So before I proceed, I'm going to kind of frame the pace that we're going to start moving on. I'm going to call this coasting. I can move very quickly, and I'm a multitasker. So if there's any point where you need a pause, but I'm going to start moving through multiple artists and highlighting the works at kind of a fast clip. The reason I'm doing this is to share observed trends, but I want to be very clear that even though I'm going to share certain themes and trends, I'm not meaning to neatly box the artists as if they're only simply excavating that one theme. Many of them are multi-layered, multifaceted, and can fit in many of them. This is just a way for us to kind of highlight the topography and really exhibit the vastness of the sheer number of artists that I've come across who could fit within this framework. So in thinking first about Dalit futurism, we're going to begin with the work of Ocean Siva, who activates a socially engaged pop surrealistic style of artwork she calls Tamil Dalit futurism. Her site-specific and digitally generated works present viewers with neo-mythologies and speculative world-building in the form of futuristic oases and empowered and distinctly queer individuals. Siva's approach to futurism, like Afro-Futurism, is rooted in the experiences of oppressed people due to geopolitical reasons and aims to reclaim and celebrate her Tamil history and culture as well as her queerness. Siva grew up between Taiwan, China, and Tamil Nadu, India. Her socially engaged practice is based on her family history and inspired by local communities, science fiction, comic books, and the distinct aesthetics of lived environments. For Shiva, it is critical that visual representations of futurism circulate not just through technology and digital imaging, but also in accessible, materially based forms, such as prints, zines, and public artworks like this mural. While technology offers tools to visualize speculative futures and stay connected, these tools are often bound up with privilege and accessibility and censorship. So the mural pictured here, Protectors and Providers, for example, animates the integral role of women in the local fisherfolk community of Chennai who sustain the health of their households and economy. So why is this so important? Researcher, author, and curator Preetika Nayak theorizes in her essay that Dalit futurism is a methodological tool that enables the exploration of caste futures in alternate worlds. It upholds Ambedkarism, which resists caste discrimination by uncovering how caste influences different aspects of social, cultural, and political reality. It recognizes the potential in science fiction to defamiliarize the familiar. As a result, it can disrupt, question, and challenge various notions about the caste system. I'd like to spend some time with this notion of defamiliarizing the familiar, which is a familiar concept in anthropology, as a conceptual tied to Afro-Futurism and beyond. This technique challenges us to consider our preconceived notions and forces us to see worlds and systems in a fresh and unexpected way. We had the pleasure of hearing the talks earlier today, and so I looped that example in as well on Basement Study, written by Rahul Sankrityayan and published in 1924. I'll give a quick summary for those unfamiliar with the story. It begins with the main character, a retired teacher emerging from a cave after a sleep of 200 years, where he encounters a utopia in India, which is free of British rule, of caste and communal discord, and where society is organized on the basis of rationality. and for the benefit and enrichment of each individual. So we had the pleasure of getting a deep dive into that an hour ago. So if we consider futurism as a methodological tool of helping people push past barriers and limitations of time and space, not to change the past, but to re-envision the past, then authors like Sankar Dayan and Octavia Butler indeed employed nonlinear concepts of time to defamiliarize the familiar, the former in regards to caste, for example, and the latter to slavery. In the novel Kindred, the protagonist Dana is born in 1950, a free woman, but is sent back in time to bring light critical issues that are often overlooked or inadequately addressed by the historical slave records. That time travel is fictitious as a given, but the history of slavery inherent in Kindred is not. However, it is through the paranormal device of time travel that readers can identify with the experience of slavery, consequently eliminating the ideology of distance which characterizes other slave narratives. So as we imagine futurity, how do we continue defamiliarizing the familiar with the language we opt for when describing our frameworks? We must constantly tease out the threads that connect experiences across diasporas and geographies. So we're going to coast now to the framework of brilliant artist, brand and curator Vishal Kumaraswamy, who is based in Bangalore and currently in Melbourne, Australia for a curatorial fellowship, and who opts for the phrase subaltern futurism rather than Dalit futurism. So again, I'm going to give a little context that might be already familiar to some of you, but making sure that everybody's kind of on the same plane as we move forward. As many of you know, Dalit comes from a word that means crushed or broken contentiously, and there are those who opt to use it as an act of resistance and reclamation, and those who do not, opting for terms like Ambedkarite, a nod to Baba Saheb, philosopher, radical emancipatory leader, Dalit rights activist, and architect of the Indian Constitution, or the term Bahujan, which means majority of the people. The term subaltern was coined by 20th century Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci in his 33 prison notebooks as a coded word to pass through prison censors. So the term subaltern as well is a mutable one. You can be subaltern in one region and not another, dominant in one, dominant and not in another. It's not universal. But what this language gives us is the potential to draw connections not just from caste-oppressed communities, but to trans-diasporic and transnational parallels to marginalized groups everywhere, which is exactly what Vishal is doing, which I'm going to highlight in the work we're about to see from him. And we're going to do this by looking at the observed trend of preservation of language when it comes to futurisms. As we consider the rising state of ethno-nationalist and fascist movements across the world, preservation of language is one of the themes I saw emerge. And it's especially prescient given where we're at now, as we look at the subcontinent and the rapid spread of English language, as well as the dominance of certain languages over regional languages. So in his 4-part film, Urdu, Kumaraswamy presents the subject who we see here sitting on the coast as a subaltern male body, posed as a set of struggle, subjugation, resilience, who carries, and I quote, physical, communal, familial, and emotional weight, as the video states. The main figure seems to be on a never-ending voyage, moving through natural, digital, and domestic spaces. And the artist makes poignant parallels between the resistance of Black, Indigenous, and Dalit communities by engaging with the liberatory teachings of Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Fred Moten, Stephanie Dinkins, Baba Saheb, and more. So I'm going to play a short clip just to demonstrate the way that Vishal is doing this. And hopefully I will make this transition seamlessly.
We are wedded in language, have our being in words.
That's the highest level.
Is also a place of struggle.
ನನ್ನ ದೇಹ ಒಂದು ಮಗ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ಸಮಾಜದ ಆಡಳಿತದ ಸೂತ್ರಗಳು ಶತಮಾನಗಳ ಅಧೀನತೆಯನ್ನು ನ್ಯಾಯ ಸಮ್ಮತಗೊಳಿಸಿ ಅದನ್ನೇ ಕಾನೂನು ಎಂದು ಕ್ರೋಢೀಕರಿಸಲಾಗುತ್ತದೆ.
So if you're familiar with some of the readings that or the authors that I referenced, you'll recognize some of these lines, and also it's, meshed together with some of Vishal's own writing. And as you observed, the film is oscillating between English and Kannada, drawing a line, this is in the artist's words, drawing a line between the perpetuated colonization of Hindi on non-Hindi speaking majority people, as Hindi is wielded as a tool by the Hindu right to make falsified assertions of homogeneous unity. We observe the preservation of language as well in Afro-Futurism, as oscillating between invented languages as well as existing languages. For example, in the blockbuster hit Wakanda, the film oscillates between English and isiXhosa, one of South Africa's 11 chosen languages. Similarly, Nigerian-American author Nedi Okorafor uses Hausa and English. She departs from the term Afro-Futurism, however, opting for African Futurism or Afro-Jujuism, African Jujuism. So we coast next to another prominent artist, Subhash Devi Limbu, whom we're also going to get to dive into a bit later, who presents a framework that he calls Adivasi Futurism in the indigenous science fiction audiovisual work, Ningwasam, in which the protagonists travel back in time to a future where interplanetary civilizations are living in harmony with the Earth. The film addresses land sovereignty, different notions of time and memory, climate change, and folklore ritual. And so you'll see the protagonist pictured here. Ningwasam is shot in Sherpa Nation, Yakdun Nation, Niwa, which is Kathmandu, and narrated entirely in indigenous Yakdupan, the language of the Adivasi tribe or Limbu people from current-day eastern Nepal. As part of Subhash's process, he sought counsel with academics and elders in his community to translate the script because at the time he was not fluent himself. So this project really became a way for him to further connect with his community and thus work to preserve a language that he himself had been wanting to dive into deeper. So beyond linguistic tradition, Limbu employs cultural symbols of the Yakdun people, such as Salam Sakma. So you see that here, here, and it's also depicted in the mothership of the which I guess I'll bring back into a little bit later. So we see that in the clothing, the jewelry, the mothership, the vehicle which transports folks back and forth. Historically, the symbol is used as a cultural identifier outside of Yakdun homes and as a ritualistic object to ward off evil and bring protection during ceremonies. It is now commonly worn as a badge during significant community events and is the official indigenous organization logo. And so we're going to now do our coasting, back and forth between Afro-Futurism as well, and highlighting some artists there, where I saw some great curatorial connections. It is with the same spirit of the iconic David Hammonds, an American artist with an oeuvre of over 50 years, largely known for his conceptual works and practice making sculptures from the highly charged detritus of urban life and Black culture states the following. Outrageously magical things happen when you mess around with the symbol. Which brings us to our next observed trend of the neo-artifact, a timeless object that includes features of ancient objects impacted by futuristic imaginations, collapsing limitations from the historical to the right now to the future. Again, something I'm pretty sure all of us can agree on, but Euro-American institutions have historically displayed the visual culture of the global majority in a manner that perpetuates stereotypes of an ancient exotic other that exists for the purpose of collection, exploitation, and ownership. Today, artists referencing this imperial practice often reimagine these historical objects and methods of creating and exhibiting them. And this is Alison Starr, who's part of the assemblage movement. What they're doing is creating these nuanced conversations about familial and social ties, contemporary identity within living tradition, and world-building beyond colonial frameworks. This sculpture is from California-based Alison Starr, who's the daughter of Betty Starr. And she was part of the assemblage movement, which came about in the 1980s, kind of taking the detritus that was left over from multiple protests in the United States and creating, kind of these neo-artifacts and these new items. So I return again to Afro-Futurism as a landing point, and I'm going to highlight artist Sun Ra, a musician, composer, poet, probably considered a pioneer of the Afro-Futurist movement, who claimed that he took a trip to Saturn and returned to Earth with the mission to use music to heal and help people transcend oppression. So in seeking connections between ancient Egypt and the emerging space age, he took his name from the Egyptian sun god and used a mixture of Egyptian space imagery in his costumes. As seen in his film Space is the Place, Space is the Age, he adapted eccentric and bold clothing, drawing from multiple influences to portray his character. We're going to host now to an artist that I'm also incredibly excited about. All the artists I'm sharing with you today I'm incredibly excited about. Rajni Pereira, who's an artist of Sri Lankan background based in Canada. And we're going to look at her Traveler series, which takes place in an off-world. And so I just wanted to take like a nice deep look at these artifacts that she's creating. In this off-world, the travelers are posthuman, living in a posthuman, post-apocalyptic future where the mutated humanoid and bestial species have adapted to survive after an ecological collapse. So they've created these items that, their pupils have multiplied, they've grown new limbs, they have developed multi-ancestral technologies and defensive tools to ensure their survival. And we're going to look at one painting in particular, Journey Drought, and look at how it's drawing connections to aesthetics across cultures. So Pereira is clearly drawing from her own upbringing in Sri Lanka and observations of the zoological. Her father and her uncle did many expeditions into the jungle and would regularly bring home birds, snakes that she would get to get up close and personal with. And so here we see 5 figures in bright clothing traversing a galactic terrain. This marbled paper that's very signature to her work. Their clothing and adornment consists of recognizable elements from global art history and artistic anthropology. For example, we might recognize references to Mughal art in the curvature of the hands or the profile of the face from the side, and the hat worn by the orange figure being reminiscent of the buku hat of the Turkic or East Asian origins. So what Rajni is doing is offering an imagination post-crisis, in this case of climate change. Conversely, we might look at an artist like Afro-Futurist Nick Cave, who's a Chicago-based artist and educator, who's creating new artifacts in response to a different kind of crisis, a socio-political crisis. These are sound suits and are kind of iconic. Nick Cave is very well regarded artist, and he created his first sound suits in response to the Rodney King, the beating of Rodney King by police officers in LA in 1991. So by creating these spacesuits, what's happening is the wearer is at once hypervisible and anonymous. The suits represents the position of the members of society who are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and whose individual humanity is often denied. Like Rajni's artifacts, the sound suits are offering protection as well. The ornamental headdresses obscure and transform the identities of those who wear them, obstructing bias on the basis of race, gender, and class. And we coast now to the final, perhaps most pronounced thematic tie. And I purposely kept this presentation a little clipped so we can leave more time for exploration and questions. This theme is perhaps one that I see emerging the most strongly across the artists that I've been observing, which is that of climate change. And we've seen that in some of the artists I already highlighted today, such as Limbo and Pereira, and many that I'm not going to get a chance to. So climate change across continents requires transnational and regenerative visions of shared futures. The world's most vulnerable regions suffer from the extractive habits of the world's healthiest. So according to the World Bank, more than half of all South Asians have been affected by one climate disaster in the last 2 decades, and more than 800 million are reported to be living in climate hotspots. Meanwhile, rising air and ocean temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, rising sea levels, and changing ocean chemistry will affect people and ecosystems that are gathered here today. As I return to Haiti year after year, I observe the impact of drought and dying citrus. And I see some responses to this graphic, so I'm curious to hear about that when we come back. I totally just pulled it up on worldbank.com. So in this section, I'm going to draw upon the material feminist theory of weathering, which pushes us to imagine our bodies as an archive of climate. How do we essentially bring climate as distant as the ice caps and as close as our own skin? In the words of Astrid Anonymous and Rachel Lowen Walker in their essay, Weathering Climate Change in the Thick Time of Transcorporeality. In other words, ecological events do not happen around us, but among us, through us, and by us. These artists propel us to hold on to an awareness of the locality our locality, our understandings of the ways in which we relate to our direct environments, and how that in turn can transform the ways that we relate to one another, thus continuing to map this idea of mythic terrain. And so this is the last artist we're going to spend time with today, before I highlight some contemporary examples of exhibitions happening in the United States. We're looking at a framework of queer Muslim futurism and an artist named Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And I will say that in my interviews and conversations with Zulfi, I was very much struck by the fact that our grandfathers could probably never have imagined that an Ahmadi Muslim curator could be interviewing their queer son for an art project and amplifying his work. And I give that as such an example of what does futurism look like now. I do think that that's a futuristic example, and one that I think it shows the radical potential of what we're doing here today. So mutation and hybridity in particular serve as artistic tools that hold the radical potential to disturb boundaries demonstrated by Zulfi. Bhutto explores these intersections in his cyanotype work. Cyanotype is an alternative printing process which uses a chemical substance and photography. In his works, Bulaname, which charts the story of the ancient river and the Indus River dolphin, one of the world's most endangered cetaceans. The Indus River, a transboundary river of Asia that originates in the Himalayas, is one of the longest in the world. It is also a source of life as well as the hemorrhaging point for the devastating floods of 2022. The ritual of weathering takes place in many stages of the artist's process to create a series of installations. Now, if you look close here, here is Zulfi with his camera. There's actually a dolphin carcass on the table. Of course, this is one that would have been found that way, not done so for this project. So what Bhutto is doing is traveling into archival material, particularly the book Secrets of the Blind Dolphin by Dr. George Valeri, and the river itself to source material, setting up his pinhole camera, as you see on the left, to photograph. And here's where we think about the concept of weathering. How do we really consider Zulfi, who identifies as a wildlife activist, in his own process interacting with the elements to create the work and constantly meditating on the state of the river that he loves so dearly. Which is that the ritual of weathering takes place in many stages of the artist's process. He exposes the prints to sunlight on the roof of his family home and rigorously rinses the fabric in water until they finally left to dry. The ritual is simultaneously local as well as deeply global. As he says, I hope to remystify the Indus, and in doing so allow us to reimagine her as a living and ever-changing entity rather than an exploitable resource. And in recent works, what Bhutto begins to do is merge his own x-rays of his own body with bones of the dolphin itself in a journey to oneness, indicating the similarities between the differences of the human and aquatic species, and the fluidity between the human and the embodied universal ocean. And I will say that, the ocean as a space of futurisms, particularly Afro-Futurism, is an incredibly rich one. We see that with tidal optics, we see it with wave work, we see it with Alexis Pauline Gumbs, so many artists and thinkers who are driving this realm. And I've been very curious to see how artists of the diaspora are engaging with the ocean itself. There's many artists that I could highlight, and I'm more than happy to speak about a little bit more specifically in one-on-one or in our Q&A. But we're going to come back to land now. We're done with our coasting section. So we went to space, we went to Saturn with Sun Ra, we went to the ocean, and we're going to take a moment to step back. So I want to contextualize in the moment that we're in and the work that I do as an independent curator. So that means that I don't work with one specific institution, gallery, or museum. I'm committed to the artists, and I do my best to work with the artists to match them with programs that are going to significantly amplify their work and hold sacred what they're doing, as well as commit to their development. And as one that is self-taught, I take my role as a caretaker of the arts and artists very seriously. But there are very specific challenges that I've been encountering that I want to share here today. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but really just a quick summary. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of commercial landscape, working and putting together exhibitions in spaces that are meant to sell the artwork. Because historically, it's been where I've done most of my shows, even though I'm moving into a space now that's more nonprofit and museum spaces. The commercial landscape is not always the most conducive or the safest. It's kind of the Wild West out here. We don't have any code of conduct. There's no industry standards. We have no union. And so often what you find is that artists and arts workers are being exploited or taken advantage of. And it's really imperative for us to find each other and kind of determine what are the ethics we want to abide by. So one challenge I would say is definitely in mentorship, but also resources. When we think about futurisms, often we immediately go to emergent technology and things and archives, things that are really bound up in access and privilege and finances. And so I really want to emphasize the fact that some of the artists we've seen today have labored and very, very much to get to access the tools in order to present the artworks that we get to encounter, whether that looks like grants or funding or going to a computer lab in their hometown village to teach themselves how to code. We really have to consider, kind of the epistemic injustice that comes with considering futurisms. Another is that with commercial galleries, often they're not supporting or interested in immersive, installation-based artworks that they might not consider as marketable, as sellable. And similarly, I would say my role is unique as an independent curator because I'm also an art dealer. I also sell artwork. I've had to simply because it's also how I can make my ends meet. And what I've found is that currently in New York, I have yet to come across another South Asian woman who's leading her own art dealership, which just the fact that we don't even have one South Asian female-owned gallery in New York kind of emphasizes the complete gap right now of spaces that would center voices of the diaspora and the need for that. So I've been searching high and low for collectors, not just collectors, but really thinking of this idea of patronage. How do we get beyond just, I'm going to decorate my home with this artwork because I think it looks nice, but really getting people to believe in the cultural investment of developing an artist, of helping them at pivotal and early stages of their career, of gifting their work to museums or amplifying their communities or celebrating them to people who can be supportive in the early stages or pivotal stages of their career. And some of the arts I show you today, like I said, are ones that have become visible to me, but I know that there's hundreds and hundreds of more that I've had to work very hard, that I will have to continue to work very hard to learn about and to figure out how to amplify. And a third, and again, by no any means the last, is that South Asian owned, there is a lack of South Asian owned and directed spaces, of course, but there's also an exclusion of South Asian voices in Asian art initiatives. We constantly encounter Asian art, futurism, not constantly, but the last we've come across, whereas the Asia Art Society, or whether it's an Asian art symposium, you rarely will see someone who identifies in South Asia as South Asian as part of that. And an institutional example I'll give, this is not even just Asian art spaces, but a museum like the Whitney, in their plus century-long history, has only ever had 10 South Asian artists exhibiting. And so I think, just given the number of artists we know exist, it's really, it's not something I can stand for. But I really want to call into question what are the connections we can make within our networks to start to amplify and circle around some of these artists to get them these spaces, because it's only really going to be possible together. So there are definitely bright spots emerging despite these obstacles and challenges. One, of course, is something like this today, which, like I said, pinched me. Like I couldn't have even imagined that something like this could exist. And I'll highlight an exhibition that I think is incredibly exciting, and that I know I've talking to some of my friends across the globe about this, is opened recently in Oakland, and brings together over 30 marginalized artists from Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan, Afro-Indian, Indo-Caribbean, and Muslim communities to showcase the depths of creativity and community. It's called Dalit the Dreamland Towards an Anti-Caste Future, curated by Manu Kaur. It's an expansive, multidisciplinary group exhibition. So if you happen to be in Oakland, go check it out. And again, a lot of these works are often you can often see them online as well. So just doing what you can to share these out to your networks, bring them to people that might be in the area. We must do what we can to get people in these spaces. Another example I'll give is the collective called Alhamdu, which is focused on Muslim futurism. They were birthed out of Duke University, and they're an experiential arts initiative that explores Muslim futurism through immersive art exhibitions, public programming, and academic inquiry. And it's probably the first time I've seen a framework for futurisms where I was like, okay, I see myself, I can fit in there, right? And then I would be remiss if I did not share my next curation coming up in June called Space Mosque, which features an artist who identifies as a Sufi Sci-Fi futurist named Sadaf Padder, who is an amazing Bashtan artist based in New York. And what he's doing is fusing Islamic mysticism and futurism to meditate on belonging and transnationalism, and present a retro-futurist parafiction called Space Mosque, where a mosque appears from outer space, and it looks different to anybody who encounters it. And if you pray to the Space Mosque every 24 hours, one of your prayers will come true. And so what happens is that a lot of good shit happens and a lot of bad shit happens until the Space Mosque disappears, and what we're left with is sightings and artifacts. So the exhibition is going to include physical sculptures, but it's mostly photographic, showing digital renderings and physical renderings that SAS has made to realize this story of Space Mosque. And so, I look forward to more bright spots like these. I look forward to connecting with some of you more one-on-one as we dream and build and galvanize towards more expansive futures. And I guess this is the time we transition into Q&A and conversation.
Thank you, Sadaf, for this amazing presentation. I'm tempted to say your name, Sadaf, S-A-D-A-F, as South Asian Diverse Artistic Futurisms.
Let me know what I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You can quote me. So yeah, the floor is open to questions.
I'm going to bring it back to my slide. Keep it up there. Yeah. This one. Okay. What was your reaction to the graphic?
So, so one of the things, and
I'll bring it back to it.
even like yesterday and today we've been talking a lot, right? If you think about South Asian futures or of the Anthropocene as three axes, right, of a superstructure. So science, state, and market. State and market are very easy to critique because they're low-hanging fruit, right? Science is insidious. Science is insidious because it is religious in the way that it propagates itself. If you show a graph like that, it's data, right? And data is incredibly political. So when I look at that data, I see non-hotspots over most of the Himalayas, and I'm thinking that makes no sense. I'm looking at Bhutan, and it says no data. And I'm questioning why is there no data, considering that is, so what's happening over the Himalayas being a dipole of the way in which climate change is emerging, right? That spot right there at the southern part of Bhutan is where massive amount of glacial activity is all drained, right? That's the GMB Delta, that's our Bengal water pump. That's responsible for draining probably, 1/5 of fresh water on planet Earth. Why don't we have data? So when you show a map like this, and you say a severe hotspot is coming from the semi-arid tropics, this is colonial, A. B, it also shows me the kind of political economic movements that is allowing certain kinds of data to emerge. This is district level data, right? Now this is very interesting that there is non-hotspot over Arunachal, right? Versus, no data over Bhutan. All of that jumps across at folks that work with colonial cartography or understanding how South Asia is seen as the basket case of climate change, right? So one of the things which we haven't addressed is climate reductionism, which is reducing our future to climate change, right? Because what that does is it allows governments and corporations to hide behind the shroud of climate change, right? And science is there cutting the checks, saying that no, this is right? Because right now, right, $500 billion of climate finance is waiting. right? It's going to enter these spaces,
Yeah.
and it's going to build a whole bunch of problematic infrastructure, which is going to be under the guise of climate adaptation, climate mitigation. So the problem is that we can't swing from science denialism to science imperialism. We've got to be very careful when we see things like this and look at a mile over the whole desert lands of Pakistan. That is, anyway, like, there's so much wrong with it. But my point is that it's so easy to throw things like this out there and then not be questioned because it's science, right? And science is religion, right? We don't question it, but we should question it. Algorithms are telling stories about our future that are deeply problematic. If you want to break open an algorithm and you want to ask why are detection and attribution algorithms finding ways of representing precipitation and heat in different parts of the world in different ways, those are questions that are deeply entwined in power. If you're not asking those questions, then the superstructure is still in place.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that even thinking about something like the World Bank and the connection to funding and money, it reminds me of even Haiti and the Red Cross, which after the earthquake, they got $500 million and they built 6 homes. 6 homes with $500 million. So I completely recognize and appreciate your explanation of this. And I think what I look forward to is kind of who are the organizations like researchers like you, or where I can start to pull more accurate sets of data and graphics to use instead. So that's what I was really looking forward to coming here for this symposium as well. Monica and then.
Well, if there's somebody else who's a student, I'd rather be the first, actually.
Okay, we can start with you.
I'm not a student.
Student of the world.
Go ahead.
Well,
Okay, I'll
one
let you
of the
find.
things I think in this futures in South Asia, whereas I don't see sort of a representation or kind of critique of, is sort of militarism. And all of the artists you showed are in certain kinds of spaces that you would think I don't know if there's like an avoidance of that or what's going on particularly, but it just kind of is interesting to me that, you know, there's these spaces that are highly militarized and, you know, I speak also for Hawaii, but what do you see, where is that in the future? Because also tied to what Vitoli said is, you know, a lot of these science things are funded by military projects. So, you know, where are the artists' positions on these things, if they have them? I'm assuming they do, but they don't seem to be articulated in a way that I would like to see a little bit of that, I suppose.
And I would love to open that up if anyone also has input there, but I will say that that's something, and thinking about Kashmir specifically as well, that I'm still searching for, that I have yet to really encounter in a strong way, and I think I'm going to accredit it to the fact that I'm also relatively early in my journey, and I'm hoping it's out there, but I have yet to come across an artist that is specifically employing futurisms and talking about the militarization in Kashmir and across the board. But if there's anyone else who has input or a response to that question, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I really like the way so many people basically in their imagination explore futurism through space,
Yeah.
or time travel, or wearing space suits, or the space mosque and things like that. You know, it's very much like Anju's presentation in a way of Biswi Sadiq, because there's a leap from oppression to extraterrestrial. I mean, there's like a lot of 19th century Hindi and Bengali fiction, which is similar. Spaceman comes to the small village and people are like, no, it's okay. And this spaceman teaches you to leap over all the oppressions. I'm interested in how futurism then is becoming a jump and not the struggle. In other words, the struggle seems to be vacated in place of the leap. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about futurism as this jump rather than the struggle.
I think you said something, was it yesterday, of how are we in the future now as well, and I think for me, when I look at past examples, folks who are non-contemporary, no longer here, and the way they were imagining futures, I get a sense of how much they thought was possible, versus where we're at now. So if there's a setting of a story in 2020 and 2024, and now we're in 2024, kind of what is that gap? But I think with the speed of the way things are accelerating with technology, the jump is almost, from what I'm observing with some of the artists, it's almost how do we begin to return to. I'm seeing a lot of artists vying for and thinking of futurisms that connect to land, connect to agriculture, and kind of rather than looking at technology and how do we live in these really posthuman, technologically dominated worlds, how are we simplifying that? And those some of the artists I didn't highlight today, and I think that it's not so much of a jump as it is a return. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
To your question, do you consider literature or poetry or speeches like art?
Oh yeah, I think that when we look at futurisms, that often that's what's emerging first.
So someone I thought of was Arundhati Roy, and someone who critiques militarism in her art. I think her writing paints pictures, and it's poetic, and it's art, and it's one of the most beautiful writing I've ever seen. And look what happens to her. Mm-hmm. The political repression of an artist like that for speaking the truth. And I think maybe that's why we don't hear so much about critiques of fascist militarism right now, because it's such a hostile environment, not just from the military crackdown of the police and the state, but also say just people in your neighborhood or whatever, who are supporting those regimes because they're brainwashed or whatever reason, which I think all comes back to trauma. So maybe they're just traumatized and
I think that's a really good point, because when I was first beginning to write and publish some of my writings, I was really going ham and speaking from the militarization, the assassination of my uncle who was a journalist in Kashmir, the assassination of my uncle who was an Ahmadi in Pakistan. My father was like Salafi boss, because they might revoke your visa, you don't know, until you're at a point or a platform where you're going to reach masses, it's not worth the risk of our family back home. And I think that might also be, to your point of perspective, or a reason why we see some of the restraint, because we are very much living within the realities of violent regimes. James?
Sorry, I can
I
sit
was
down.
a dean of a middle school. So His own habits.
Yeah, so if they're engaged.
Right.
Get them. Well, there. I love seeing Sun Ra there, and so it made me wonder about people using music as a vehicle, and intentionally using music as a vehicle, especially because South Asian music is so potent as a vehicle, and possibly combining it, and I guess not. Possibly combining that, in an installation way or in a performance art. Are you familiar with any?
Yeah, I could do a whole other thing on that, but I'm in the midst of proposing some curations to some open calls that are kind of going exactly into that, particularly artists who are looking at Sufi tradition and combining with synth. And so a few I'll give right off the bat. An artist named Zirk Ahmed, their Slow Spin is one to check out. You're familiar with Brooklyn Raga Massive already?
Yeah.
So, they have, they got folks in their repertoire. Humesha is another one that I'll definitely check out. Zain Alam. But there's a ton that I think are really going those realms. And Sax, the artist that I highlighted last with Space Mosque, is working on a circuit board, a synth board that's actually connected to emotions. And we're, it's in prototype right now. But I think that there's there is such a rich history of sound. And something that always bothers me when I'm in galleries is that antiseptic feeling. So I usually do bring in performances and music into the space. but I look forward to, again, that's one where like I've rarely been in spaces where I'm getting a production budget or I'm getting an adequate fee where I can bridge those and allow artists to create commissions to feed the exhibition. So it's something I look forward to doing. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add to the point on militarism as well. So I would say that the artists that I have seen, especially in the context of South Pakistan, who do speak about a future where militarism is incorporated into their art. I've also seen it through literature, and particularly literature in local languages, not Urdu or English, because if the language that you're writing in is accessible, again, to the military or the state, that makes you an easy target, right? So a form of sort of going against that is subverting that local communities, including my own community, that is a target of state repression, is you using your own native language in a way that you don't, either you know, request that it not be translated, or keep it within your sort of the literary structures that are not accessible to the broader state, and that can then be used as a way to target you. So I can come up with specific names, I don't have them off the top of my head, but I would also echo what was said, that literature is a very interesting way that I've seen, at least for liminal communities in Pakistan, as a way to express themselves with their personal.
And what's the community that you feel that you're from or connected to?
I'm from the Baloch community.
I saw one more coming back there.
Yeah, thank you for that really rich presentation. I learned so much, so I wanted to lead with that. So also, the hosting was amazingly fluent. So, yeah. So my question was about futurism and identity, because I mean, you know, Dalit futurism, Tamil futurism. As a Tamil person, I say Tamil futurism, Varga, but you know. So it's like identity politics and futurism.
Yeah.
Because there's a different genealogy to futurism, right? I mean, there's Italian futurism, the 20th century. I'm thinking of Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, Ministry of the Future. Right, so there's a kind of a, not really a question, but a kind of a, maybe asking you to really think about that relationship between the idea of the future, which is very technological. When you read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, which is all about climate change, so many of those solutions are technological ones, right? And so, and if you go back to Italian futurism, then there's this link between futurism and modernity and modernism, right? Which changes when you come to Afro-Futurism because of a certain kind of ethnic/identity positioning, which makes possible a certain kind of social justice imagination. But I'm wondering about the complexity of that relationship and whether futurism doesn't commit us to a certain kind of linearity, which is something we're thinking about. Because Begumpara is in the end not the future. I mean, it's always there, has always been there, will always be there, right? I mean, it's a different, the mythic, right? It's a different way of imagining. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of questions there.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I thought that was really fascinating as I was talking to some of the artists. There really was like a resistance to, you know, not calling this what they're doing South Asian futurisms and wanting to be enough specific. And I think that part of that comes from being in a period where wanting that visibility and recognition, because they're moving into global spaces with their artwork where they're often having to explain where they're from or what that means. And I wonder if, you know, as the movement grows and continues, we're going to be able to move to a space where we're able to collapse some of those terms and find more unifying terms as well. And then I think when it comes to Italian futurism as well, there definitely are like really stark points of divergences to the futurisms that we're seeing in Afro-Futurism and the framework we saw today, which is, you know, a departure from the emphasis on violence or on youth, or there definitely is still an emphasis on machinery and multimedia, which I think is the through line there. But I definitely think that there's some things that are challenged when we look at Italian futurisms. But yeah, I think that there's a really delicate balance here, because I always ask an artist, you know, how do you want to be described? Do you want to be described as at all in terms of where you're from or how you identify? And I do it case by case. Sometimes it's not necessary. If it's not necessary, I don't do it, you know. But I do wonder if there's going to be a point where, you know, some of the artists, again, a lot of the artists I highlighted are also quite young in their journeys, you know, and so I'm very curious to see as we move forward how they might also start to shift and mutate the terms that they're using to describe their frameworks and allow it to be more overlapping or more encompassing.
It's just like a response, but also thinking about the problem of South Asia, like using the language of South Asia, right? So many of us who came from different parts of South Asia only started calling ourselves South Asian when we came to the US, you know, like didn't even think, I mean, also the collapsing of South Asia as India. So I think this makes me think about like who's the viewer, you know, like who's consuming a lot of this art, especially as you're talking about, you're based in New York, right? Like a lot of these galleries. And I wonder if the specificity of using words like Dalit and indigenous, Adivasi makes more sense in like the context where you're from, you know, like if the gallery is based in Delhi or Lahore. Yeah, I don't know if yeah, like how you did grapple with this question of South Asia, but is that something is this just a placeholder, or do you feel like till you figure out a better language?
Yeah, no,
it does come with a lot of those problems, especially collapsing of South Asia with India, and not just India, but northern India, Bengali, like specific, you know, hegemonic forms of nationalisms in the South Asia.
Yeah, no, I think 100% it's a placeholder, and I think even when you look at the more specific terms like Futurism, even that, it can be homogenizing, right? We're looking at Dalit futurism, there's so many ways to be and exist within that framework, and so I think saying that there's one way that it looks is dangerous. And I will say, you know, I'm an East Coast girl, you know, I grew up in New York, New Jersey, Baltimore, DC, so that's my experience. But you know, I remember growing up, and when I was little, I'd be like, okay, I'm Indian, and then I was like, well, I guess I'm Pakistani because my mom was born there, and it's like, okay, I'm Kashmiri, but I'm half, like, what do I even say, right? We know that South Asian, it doesn't really do the job as we need, and I'm very curious about kind of where that's going to go, how we're going to go, but what I will say is that from my observation of what I'm seeing in New York, and artists that are getting more traction as being artists of the diaspora, they are often coming from, you know, caste privilege backgrounds. They are often Indian, and I've seen artists borrowing or taking mythologies and stories from some of these more marginalized communities and have no awareness of it. You know, borrowing stories from mythologies and religious texts and having no understanding of the links to caste and really claiming this caste invisibility as their guard of like, well, it doesn't affect me, so. And I will say that like I have to really credit and thank artists like Vishal and Subhash, who early on in my own journey gave me readings and challenged me and pushed me, and I think allowed themselves to open and recognize kind of in my coming from a perspective where, you know, the only other Kashmiri Ahmadi Muslims I've met in the United States are my sisters. You know, so when I'm in a South Asian space, it's really not often I'm finding my own story depicted, and that's not the goal of myself as a curator, but I do continue to wonder like how I'm going to render that visible and what language comes to use, because yeah, you know, we're going to need to retire South Asia at some point, you know, and come up with our own, and that's why I look at Afro-Futurism in that term, and have really enjoyed learning about artists who are challenging even that term and why, and paying attention to the words and the terms that the artists I'm in community with are using.
Sometimes we use the word desi.
Yeah.
But only we understand it and Americans wouldn't. And South Asia is more.
Yeah, but even then there's criticism of that's really depicting and coming from the north, and there's communities that definitely feel excluded by the word desi as well. I really have encountered a term where, you know, sometimes I'll say brown town, but even that has like, you know, has its complications. And so, you know, we don't figure it out. You know, maybe the next symposium is just us deciding.
Well, the other thing is you become, you know, centric. Like, is it U.S. versus European,
right.
You know? And so there's like all this diversity within that term and who we represent. So I just feel like these are just sort of shorthand for
sure.
a kind of understanding
Yeah.
that's real broad, but we within our groups know our specificity and how they're different.
Yeah, and I will say, like, there's artists that I would say are operating some South Asian futurisms who are not South Asian, you know, and I'm curious about how to sort of bring them into the framework and in the conversation. I have an artist, a friend of mine who's Haitian and Trini, Nugent Smith, Afro, you know, from an African diaspora, but definitely engaging with some of the same themes and being impacted by the cultures he grew up in, which are very much connected to the region of South Asia. So I think that if we really want to believe that what we're creating is a transnational framework, we're going to also have to start thinking about who is operating those frameworks, who are not coming from those.
And I think you did that by looking at both Afro-Futurism and what
That was
they're calling.
Bosch's feedback for me, you know. Thank you, guys.
I understand that our current practice and vision of future is very trauma informed, and we're working through our traumas and oppression. And I was wondering what space we have for joy and reclaiming joy actually as part of overcoming the trauma.
I love that. You know, I think a great example is the Dalit Dreamlands exhibition that I showed, and their opening is not just like a come and sip some wine and look at the art, it's a whole dance party. You know, it's a dance party in an art exhibition space. Like, that is so, I think it's moments like that and things like that that are gonna help us get there. But I will say again, like, I think that is very much a challenge because, you know, when I've seen communities of artists and arts workers in New York try to form around the identity of South Asian, they often quickly fracture. And there's definitely these intergenerational fractures, and I feel like we've, you know, myself and my peers almost feel as if we've inherited some of that, and I think it's a great thing to always consider. So I would say, at least in my own curations, I do my best to have programming that allows us to break kind of that fourth wall. We're not just coming and looking, but we're engaging in conversation and having these events or workshops that are more joyful. But I will say, like, I don't think joy is my forte. So, you know, my therapist told me I don't laugh too much. And I was like, you're correct, you know, so it's something that I also have to consider and work on, because it is very easy to lean into, well, this is what has happened to us. But also coming from a culture where, like, I grew up in a very conservative culture. There was no music, dance, art. There was a separation of genders, and this is in New Jersey, you know what I mean? So I think that it's also considering, you know, the impact of upbringing and kind of, I've been a little subversive in some of my curations that are opening in Philly, where I know there's artworks I'm putting in it, 20 minutes from my mosque, where my father's gonna come, and I'm like, ooh, you know, you're about to see a nude figure, like, doing wazoo, like, no, I'm gonna talk about that, but to me, that's joy as well. You know, to kind of bring my parents into spaces that they've never been in before and see them start to consider and think about things and bring them new experiences. You know, it might not look like laughter and dancing, but I think that those are definitely incredibly bright spots. Cool. Yeah.
First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. I guess, yeah, I can definitely relate to what you were saying about South Asian identity. It's like I grew up in Canada, not mixed, like Indian, Hawaiian, all sorts of stuff. But like I remember learning all these terms, like they were new to me. Like I didn't know how to describe myself. So, like I remember learning what brown was and like South Asian, and then like people ask you what you are, like say South Asian, it's like a you know, like disappointment, like you're not gonna play the game or like specify exactly what they want to hear. Yeah, so I think I think like relating that to the diaspora experience, yeah, what stuck out to me was when you showed that last slide from the Space Mosque. That really reminded me of, I think it was this African American museum in DC. They have like something on Parliament, the band, I think it's Parliament, one of these successive bands they had. Yeah, like that movement, and they had a spaceship that kind of reminded me of that. I think that is like a great way to use space to kind of create your own identity. It's like a blank space, you're free to do what you want. But just what Dr. Prashad mentioned earlier about, I guess, South Asian representation and sci-fi stuck out to me. Is like, I can't really think of that many examples, and I've seen like, you know, the Bollywood E.T. and what's that Amir Khan movie, PK or whatever, and I guess Dev Patel in this movie called Chappie. But like, there's not that many examples of that, and I wonder like, what are your thoughts on like the framing of, you know, the 70s version of space as a form of identity versus now where I think there's more, and like relating to climate change, where there's like this vision of the Elon Musk terraforming Mars as space, where it's like an escape, where, I don't know, I just wonder like, do you think that has changed how South Asians would want to represent their own identity through the lens of like space futurism?
Well, you know, I wasn't around in the 70s, so I don't have that full perspective. But my mother is like a big sci-fi, you know, I grew up with that, you know, and I remember early on her introducing Doom and Star Trek and these things, and I'm really grateful for that, because I think that as an Ahmadi Muslim growing up in London in the 70s, that was her way of finding and escaping and troubling kind of what does it look like for me to exist in a place where there's very few like me. So, you know, to that point of does it look different? I wouldn't say I'm informed enough to comment on that. However, a lot of the artists that I've highlighted, I know are referencing and thinking about thinkers and speakers and writers from those eras. So I need to dig a little bit more there. But I guess I'm curious about, you know, when was kind of the first time or first place, was it literature or a movie or show where you encountered that you felt represented or connected? This is a question back to you.
Well, like, I remember Harold and Kumar was like a big deal.
Which one or what?
White Castle. You know, funny because Sachs is the creative director of White Castle, so you must have felt something there with Sachs. But film, I think that film is also a way that now I'm seeing, one of the most visible is that we start to see representation first and foremost, and you know, majority of, I am starting to see more films coming out of Pakistan and coming out of these other places. I'm looking forward to seeing Dev's newest film as well, because we were talking about this yesterday, really, like, you know, how does that address and trouble these things? But I will say, I think, because I grew up not being allowed to watch TV, I'm behind on like films and TV in general as well. So I need to go back and really dig into some of these references myself. But film is absolutely one of the first places that I think many of us start to feel connected. And I will say, at least for my own mother, that was definitely the case.
If I can ask just one more question, I already asked one. What does the term alternative reality do that futurism, you know, is that, you know, and I'm thinking of Farah Jeet's, I don't know if you know Farah Jeet's work, the filmmaker, the Tamil filmmaker, who's also a kind of a cultural entrepreneur in Chennai, and very interesting, and a really important filmmaker. I would suggest, you know, he made Kala and Kavali, you know, the Rajinikanth films, huge blockbusters, but he also does interesting work in sort of alternative cinema. But he has this thing called the Castless Collective, which is active in music, in art. He has his own bookstore, and he's a Dalit filmmaker and a Dalit sort of. And it's not anti-caste features; it's Castless Collective, right? So, and I think in some of his work you can see him really sort of alternative realities rather than a future, right? You know, which is a different way of thinking about some of the material that he was so richly uncovered.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to like that idea of now, right? These are things that can happen or should be happening now, and they don't necessarily require technologies that don't yet exist or frameworks that don't yet exist. And I think that that's the key difference between alternate reality and futurism. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. Thank you, Saeed. We are supposed to have lunch now, the lunch is late. So please help yourselves to coffees, and the caterers will be arriving shortly. We have 2 lunch options, and it's about half and half. If you do not have a badge, I would like to ask you to please wait for the people that do have a badge to make sure they get their lunch. And it's half and half. One is Thai chicken and plain rice, and the other one is chana masala with yellow rice, which is vegan.
Okay. And what happens if we open it inside?
What happens if you open it? Oh, no, I just mean eat it in here or eat it outside, but like when you're carrying it, don't be eating as you walk through the library. It's obvious.
So you don't get into trouble and shut down the, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so here we go. It's coming. Thank you. It was wonderful. We're gonna be
Are you gonna make me a new map?
I'm gonna make you a new map. Yeah, like that lady back there. That's like
Perfect.
indigenous people.
Perfect.
This shit is like long been broken. But
the map.
sort of it's online and it's an artist collective that created a map of the world, but from that radical. So there's a lot of like community involved and it's
I got it's like hard. It's like because I'm freelance doing so hard. I'm like just like have the time to sit down and search.
you don't need that's why you don't need it. That's why you can you shouldn't go there. So that's why like political people like
I've never met someone who does what you do.
and you break it down. The science is something that's trying to find someone says something like, oh well, look at it.
Yeah, I know, and you're totally right, and it's a great point of view.
Because it's like, what are you going to do? Now there's this whole, there's just a lot of chemical data.
How do we
Like how do we create algorithms that are just as based instead of just it's kind of something so I find about this more like going from the research Sure.
and that being a symbol.
That's been taken care of. I get that. I mean, climate change is happening.
Yeah.
I know it's about it. But my point is that when you see floods in the we're like climate change. What you do is you use it in solving mistakes. Saying, yo, let's do nothing. And so there is a whole movement now called neo-natural association. There is no natural
Even when we're working on we keep saying with community center movement that we want it to be natural disaster relief, but really that's not
I mean, look, you should check out our book. We have science called it's literally like showing how the British have colonized and manufactured factories.